It takes less than 5 minutes to end the world. That's not a metaphor, not a theory. 5 minutes from detection to decision. 5 minutes for a radar screen to light up. 5 minutes for a man in uniform to pick up a red phone. 5 minutes for another man, somewhere else, to decide whether to answer fire with fire. October 27, 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The closest this planet has ever come to nuclear annihilation. And in the middle of it all, deep beneath the Black Atlantic waters, one Soviet submarine carried a weapon that could have triggered World War III with a single command. One missile, one decision, one man who refused to turn a key. If you wore the uniform during the Cold War, you already know the feeling. The low hum of tension that never really left the air. You trained for a war that everyone prayed would never come, yet everyone believed eventually would. And in October of '62, that war felt not just possible, but imminent. Washington and Moscow were staring each other down. American reconnaissance flights had confirmed Soviet nuclear missiles stationed in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade. The Soviets called it an act of aggression. The world held its breath. But while the politicians argued above ground, something far more dangerous was unfolding underwater. The Soviet Navy had dispatched 4 Foxtrot-class submarines toward the Caribbean. Diesel-electric boats, not nuclear-powered. They had to surface periodically to recharge batteries. And the U.S. Navy, enforcing the quarantine line, began detecting them. American destroyers started dropping practice depth charges, harmless by design, signaling devices meant to force submarines to surface. But here's the part that chills your blood. The Soviet crews didn't know they were practice charges. Put yourself in that steel hull for a moment. It's over 100 degrees inside. Air is stale. Carbon dioxide levels rising. Batteries nearly depleted. American ships overhead. Explosions rocking the hull. No communication with Moscow for days. No clarity. No confirmation. Just the sense that war may have already begun. One of those submarines was B-59, and on board B-59 was a nuclear torpedo. Not a small tactical weapon, not symbolic, a 10-kiloton nuclear warhead. Roughly the size of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. If fired at an American aircraft carrier, it would have vaporized it. Thousands dead instantly. And in 1962, there would have been no measured response. No pause. The United States would have assumed full-scale nuclear war had begun. Retaliation would have followed within minutes. Strategic bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, cities erased from maps. Inside B-59, Captain Valentin Savitsky believed that moment had come. The submarine had been underwater for days. Heat and exhaustion were breaking the crew down. U.S. destroyers above were dropping depth charges to signal them to surface. But Savitsky didn't know they were signals. He believed they were being attacked, believed war had already started. And under Soviet protocol, the nuclear torpedo could be launched if 3 senior officers agreed. Savitsky was ready. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov agreed. There was only one dissenting voice left, Vasily Arkhipov. Remember that name, because history almost forgot him. Arkhipov wasn't loud. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't deliver some cinematic speech. He simply refused to authorize the launch. Calmly, firmly, against enormous pressure. He argued they had no confirmation of war, that surfacing was the only responsible option. He stood against his captain in a moment where fear and pride could have pushed the world into fire. And here's what makes this even more extraordinary. Arkhipov had already survived one nuclear crisis the year before aboard the submarine K-19, a reactor accident that nearly killed him. He understood the stakes of radiation, of escalation, of irreversible decisions. He knew once that torpedo left the tube, there was no calling it back, so he held the line. The argument inside B-59 lasted minutes, maybe longer. Records are fragmented, but eventually Savitsky relented. The submarines surfaced. American destroyers surrounded them, guns trained, but no missiles flew, no torpedoes launched, no nuclear flash lit up the Caribbean sky. The world never knew how close it had come. And that's the thing about near misses in war. The public remembers the speeches, the summits, the official resolutions. But the real turning points often happen in silence, in tight metal compartments, in rooms where oxygen is running thin and tempers are running hot. Decisions made by individuals whose names never make headlines. For those of you who served, you understand chain of command. You understand protocol. But you also understand that sometimes history hinges not on following procedure blindly, but on judgment, on restraint, on the moral courage to say no when everything around you screams yes. In 1962, both superpowers were locked in a doctrine called Mutually Assured Destruction, MAD. The idea was simple and terrifying. If either side launched nuclear weapons, the other would respond in kind. Total annihilation guaranteed. Peace through the promise of extinction. It worked in a brutal way, but it only worked if cooler heads prevailed in moments of crisis. October 27th became known as Black Saturday. That same day, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. Another U-2 accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Alaska. Military commanders were on edge. DEFCON levels elevated. Strategic forces ready. It was the most dangerous 24 hours of the 20th century. And beneath the waves, B-59 had nearly added a nuclear detonation to that equation. Imagine the chain reaction. An American carrier group destroyed. Washington interpreting it as the first strike. Immediate retaliation against Cuba. Soviet response against NATO targets in Europe. Intercontinental missiles launched. Tens of millions dead in the first hours. Hundreds of millions in the weeks that followed. Fallout clouds circling the globe. Civilization permanently altered. All because one submarine captain believed war had begun. And all prevented because one officer insisted they verify before acting. Think about that. The fate of the world balanced on the judgment of a man few outside naval history circles had ever heard of. That's the missile that almost started World War III. But this story isn't just about one submarine. It's about the fragility of deterrence, the psychological strain of Cold War service, the burden placed on men tasked with carrying weapons capable of ending civilization. It's about how easily miscalculation, miscommunication, and fear can spiral into catastrophe. And in the next chapter of this story, we're going deeper, into the strategic chess match above the surface, into the minds of leaders who were gambling with extinction. Because what happened aboard B-59 was only one piece of a much larger crisis, one that tested not just military strength, but human restraint at every level of command. We're going to examine how close Washington and Moscow truly came to pressing the button, what intelligence failures nearly tipped the balance, and how lessons from 1962 still echo in modern nuclear doctrine today. Before we move forward, I want you to sit with this for a moment. If you've ever stood watch, if you've ever waited for orders you hoped would never come, you know that war is often seconds away from ignition. And sometimes the only thing standing between peace and catastrophe is the quiet resolve of one person who refuses to escalate. And the clock was still ticking. When B-59 surfaced in the Caribbean heat, exhausted sailors blinking into the sun, the men in Washington had no idea how close they had come to watching an aircraft carrier disappear in nuclear fire. They did not know that somewhere beneath the surface, a launch had nearly been authorized. They did not know that a single dissenting officer had just prevented escalation beyond recall. And that ignorance is part of what makes October 1962 so sobering. The people with their fingers closest to the trigger often had only fragments of the picture. In the White House, inside the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known simply as ExComm, President John F. Kennedy sat at the head of a long table surrounded by generals, intelligence chiefs, and political advisors. The photographs from those meetings show tight jaws and furrowed brows. No one smiling, no one relaxed. These were not men debating theory, they were calculating survival. U-2 reconnaissance photos had confirmed Soviet medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Cuba, operational, capable of striking Washington, New York, Chicago. The Soviet premier Nikita Khrushchev had publicly denied placing offensive weapons there. Now the evidence was undeniable. The United States announced a naval quarantine, deliberately avoiding the word blockade because blockade is an act of war under international law. Every word mattered. Every phrase was weighed against how it would sound in Moscow. The military option was on the table from the beginning: airstrikes to destroy the missile sites, followed by invasion. The Joint Chiefs argued that decisive action would demonstrate resolve. They worried that hesitation would signal weakness. Many of them were veterans of World War II and Korea. They had seen what happened when aggression went unchecked. From their perspective, allowing Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba was unacceptable. But Kennedy hesitated, not because he lacked resolve. He had served in combat himself. He understood what escalation meant. He also understood something critical about nuclear weapons. Once used, they changed the character of war permanently. There is no limited nuclear exchange in practice. There is only a ladder of retaliation. While XCOM debated, American forces went to DEFCON 2. That is one step short of full-scale nuclear war. Strategic bombers were armed and airborne. Intercontinental ballistic missile crews were on heightened alert. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles were ready. The machinery of annihilation was primed. In Moscow, Khrushchev was under his own pressure. Soviet leadership feared encirclement. U.S. Jupiter missiles were already stationed in Turkey, within striking distance of Soviet territory. From their vantage point, placing missiles in Cuba was strategic parity, a counterbalance. But now American naval forces were stopping Soviet ships on the high seas. The risk of confrontation was immediate. Messages between Washington and Moscow moved slowly. Diplomatic cables, back-channel communications, each side trying to read the other's intentions without revealing too much. And in that delay, uncertainty thrived. On October 27th, the same day B-59 nearly launched its nuclear torpedo, events spiraled further. A U-2 reconnaissance aircraft piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson was shot down over Cuba. He was killed. In another sector, a separate U-2 strayed into Soviet airspace near Alaska due to navigational error. Soviet fighters scrambled. American fighters armed with nuclear air-to-air missiles launched to escort it. For a brief window, nuclear-armed aircraft were maneuvering within sight of each other. This was not one crisis. It was multiple crises layered on top of each other. Imagine sitting in that war room as reports filter in. A spy plane down, another potentially intercepted, Soviet submarines detected, military commanders pressing for action, intelligence incomplete. You are the President of the United States, or you are the Premier of the Soviet Union, and you have minutes to decide how to respond. For those of you who've served in command positions, you understand the weight of incomplete information. You understand how dangerous assumptions can be. In 1962, assumptions could have meant cities erased. Kennedy's decision-making style during the crisis was deliberate. He encouraged debate. He allowed dissent. He asked questions repeatedly, pressing advisors to consider second- and third-order consequences. When some urged immediate airstrikes after the U-2 was shot down, he resisted. He recognized that Moscow might not have ordered the shootdown directly. It could have been a local commander, a miscalculation. Responding with force might remove any remaining space for diplomacy. At the same time, Khrushchev was receiving alarming reports from his own commanders. American naval forces were aggressive. Soviet submarines were being harassed. Communications were intermittent. The potential for local commanders to act independently was real. In fact, aboard B-59, that independence had nearly triggered catastrophe. Back-channel negotiations began to take shape. A message from Khrushchev proposed removing Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island. A second message, more demanding, insisted on the removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The tone of the messages differed, one conciliatory, one hardline. XCOM debated which to answer. Kennedy chose to respond publicly to the first, softer message, while privately signaling willingness to remove the Turkish missiles later. It was a careful balance. Publicly, the United States would not appear to trade NATO security for Cuban de-escalation. Privately, both sides would step back from the brink. The agreement was fragile. It depended on trust between adversaries who fundamentally distrusted each other. It depended on military commanders adhering strictly to civilian direction. And it depended, unknowingly, on men like Arkhipov having already chosen restraint. Here is what is rarely emphasized. Neither superpower had full control over every weapon in the field. Communications technology of the era was limited. Submarine captains had autonomy. Field commanders had authority under certain conditions. The idea that nuclear war would unfold only after careful deliberation at the highest levels was, in some cases, an illusion. That illusion almost shattered in the Caribbean. When B-59s surfaced and American destroyers realized it was armed, the shock was profound. U.S. forces had not known the Soviet submarines carried nuclear torpedoes. They had assumed conventional armament. That intelligence gap alone could have doomed millions. And that brings us to a question worth reflecting on, especially for veterans who have lived inside the machinery of deterrence. How much of peace during the Cold War was strategy, and how much was luck? How many times did human judgment, rather than doctrine, prevent irreversible escalation? If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt that weight of responsibility, I want you to pause here and share your perspective in the comments. Not political arguments, not slogans, but your experience. Because understanding how close we came in 1962 requires more than textbooks. It requires the lived insight of those who stood watch during dangerous times. And if this kind of deep historical analysis matters to you, consider subscribing and supporting this channel. These stories deserve to be told with the seriousness they demand. As the crisis moved into its final hours, tension did not evaporate overnight. Ships still shadowed ships. Missiles still sat fueled. Pilots still waited for launch codes. But gradually the temperature lowered. Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the missile sites. The United States publicly pledged not to invade Cuba and privately agreed to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey within months. On October 28th, the world stepped back from the edge. No mushroom clouds, no retaliatory strikes, no sirens over American or Soviet cities. Families went to work the next morning, unaware of how close they had come to living in a very different world. And yet something fundamental had changed. Both nations understood, more vividly than ever before, how thin the margin of safety truly was. In the aftermath, direct communication lines were established between Washington and Moscow, the so-called hotline. Arms control negotiations slowly began to take shape. The concept of crisis management evolved. But none of that erases the reality that on one October day, nuclear war was not an abstract possibility. It was minutes away. In war rooms above ground and steel compartments below the sea, men made decisions under extraordinary pressure. Some pushed for force. Others urged caution. And in the final block of this story, we are going to step back and examine what this near miss teaches us today. Not as distant history, but as a living warning. Because the weapons may be more advanced now, the technology faster, the communication instantaneous, but the human element remains the same. Fear, pride, miscalculation, and the fragile hope that somewhere in the chain of command, someone will choose restraint over destruction. When the sun rose on October 28, 1962, most of the world believed the crisis had ended because leaders had reached an agreement. Headlines focused on diplomacy, on letters exchanged between Washington and Moscow, on calculated concessions and strategic withdrawals. But the truth is more unsettling. The world survived not just because of policy, but because of people. Individuals in confined spaces, under suffocating pressure, who made choices that defied momentum. Vasily Arkhipov went back to serving in the Soviet Navy. There were no parades in his honor, no medals pinned publicly for saving humanity. In fact, much of what happened aboard B-59 remained classified for decades. His name did not circulate in history books until long after the Cold War had thawed. And that is often how history works. The loudest moments are remembered. The quiet acts of restraint are buried. But make no mistake, the missile aboard that submarine was real. The authorization protocol was real. The captain's belief that war had begun was real. The depth charges exploding overhead were real. Heat exhaustion, failing batteries, rising carbon dioxide. Imagine that environment again. Imagine the psychological compression. Steel walls sweating with condensation. Men stripped to undershirts in tropical waters because internal temperatures had climbed past tolerable limits. Equipment malfunctioning. No word from Moscow. Explosions shaking the hull. In that moment, it would have been easy to convince yourself that survival meant striking first. That is the brutal logic of escalation. If you believe the other side has already crossed the line, hesitation feels like weakness. Action feels like necessity. And yet, Arkhipov paused. He demanded confirmation. He argued that launching a nuclear torpedo without clear authorization from Moscow would guarantee catastrophe. He did not deny the danger. He did not deny the fear. He simply insisted on clarity before committing to irreversible destruction. For veterans watching this, you know how rare that kind of composure can be when adrenaline is high and information is scarce. Training prepares you for chaos. Discipline guides you through it. But character determines how you interpret it. Arkipov's character prevented a launch. Now consider the broader pattern of that crisis. An American U-2 shot down over Cuba. Another U-2 drifting into Soviet airspace. Naval forces maneuvering aggressively. Submarines harassed without knowing the intent behind the signals. Political leaders receiving conflicting messages. At multiple points, escalation could have taken over. Each moment required someone to slow the process down. President John F. Kennedy resisted immediate retaliation after the U-2 shootdown. Premier Nikita Khrushchev ultimately chose compromise over confrontation. And beneath the Atlantic, Arkhipov chose restraint over revenge. This is what makes the story of the missile that almost started World War III so powerful. It reveals that deterrence is not just about stockpiles and doctrine. It is about human beings navigating uncertainty. The Cold War was built on mutually assured destruction, a doctrine that assumed rational actors at every level. But rationality is fragile under stress. Fear narrows perception. Pride hardens positions. Miscommunication multiplies risk. In 1962, technology was slower. Communications were delayed. Today, weapons systems operate at digital speeds. Hypersonic missiles, automated detection networks, artificial intelligence layered into early warning systems. Decision windows are shrinking, not expanding. The 5 minutes I mentioned at the beginning may now be even less. So what protects us? Not just treaties, not just satellites, not just radar arrays. Ultimately, it is still people. Men and women inside command centers, submarines, silos, aircraft cockpits. Individuals trained to follow orders, yet entrusted with judgment. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated that systems can fail. Intelligence can be incomplete. Signals can be misread. And in those gaps, character becomes the final safeguard. For those who wore the uniform during the Cold War, or in any era where nuclear weapons stood ready, you carried that silent burden. You understood that your professionalism mattered not only tactically, but historically. A misinterpreted radar contact, a misheard transmission, a rushed decision, any of it could ripple outward beyond imagination. Arkhipov never sought recognition. Years later, when details surfaced after the collapse of the Soviet Union, historians began to understand how pivotal his refusal had been. Conferences on nuclear risk cited his example. Military scholars analyzed the incident as a case study in crisis management. But in 1962, none of that existed. There was only a submarine commander demanding authorization and a second-in-command who said no. The missile stayed in its tube. Think about that image. A warhead designed to annihilate an aircraft carrier, resting inert because one man insisted on verification. No dramatic countdown, no cinematic explosion, just a decision not to act. Sometimes heroism is action, charging forward, taking ground, engaging the enemy, but sometimes heroism is restraint, holding position, refusing escalation, enduring pressure without surrendering judgment. As we close this story, I want you to reflect on something. How many other moments like this have occurred in silence? How many near misses have been absorbed by disciplined professionals who never spoke of them publicly? The absence of catastrophe does not make history less dramatic. It makes it more fragile. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended with negotiated compromise. Missiles removed from Cuba, American missiles quietly withdrawn from Turkey, a direct hotline established between Washington and Moscow, arms control efforts eventually following. But beneath those policy outcomes lies a deeper lesson. Peace is not self-sustaining. It depends on vigilance, on communication, on humility in the face of destructive power. The missile that almost started World War III never launched, but it existed. It was armed, it was ready, and it came within a single decision of altering the course of human civilization. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the weight carried by those who stand watch in dangerous times, share your thoughts below. I'd especially value hearing from veterans who lived through the Cold War years. Your perspective adds depth to these histories in ways no archive can. And if you believe stories like this matter, that remembering near misses is just as important as remembering victories, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps ensure these conversations continue with the seriousness they deserve. Because history is not only shaped by the wars we fight, it is shaped, just as profoundly, by the wars we almost fought, and by the quiet professionals who made sure we never had to.